Hi everyone, my name is Sydney Yeager and I am the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm honored to introduce today's program, Reckoning with Totalitarianism, the Legacy of Hannah Arendt. Joining us today are Samantha Rose Hill and Ken Krimstein. Samantha is a senior fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities and associate faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and the University of the Underground. She is the author of Hannah Arendt, the book we will be discussing today, and Hannah Arendt's poems, which will be published in 2022. Her work has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Lit Hub, Open Democracy, Public Seminar, Contemporary Political Theory, and Theory and Event. Ken Krimstein is a cartoonist for the New Yorker magazine and is also the author of the graphic biography, The Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt, A Tyranny of Truth, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in History and has also been published in 8 languages. His new graphic history is When I Grow Up, The Lost Autobiographies of 6 Yiddish Teenagers, which came out last week. During the discussion, please feel free to share questions in the Zoom Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can during the hour. This program is being recorded and the video will be available tomorrow on the museum's YouTube channel. So thank you all again for being here, and I'm now going to hand things over to Ken and Samantha.
Thank you, Sydney.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Samantha.
Hi, Ken.
It's nice meeting you in the Zoom. And I have to say, I wonder what Hannah would think about. You have to forgive me for calling her Hannah, but I've spent so much time in her head. What would she think of Zoom?
Not you calling her Hannah.
No. She would slug me. She would punch me.
Yeah. You know, it's certainly a far cry from the public realm of appearances where we can be present before one another. But we are speaking and we are acting, and this is something of a public space. So I think she might call this the triumph of the social, since I'm in my living room.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, and we are looking into a bit of our private lives through the Zoom world, but that's something we can talk about, because, you know, something that I know fascinates us both so much is this idea of showing up face to face. What that means. It's very performative. But while we're getting started, let's say by some amazing chance, you run into somebody who doesn't know who Hannah Arendt is. I can't believe that would ever happen to you, but it might.
It does.
What do you say to them? And you only have a short amount of time, maybe an elevator ride. What do you say?
I say usually that Hannah Arendt was one of the most important German Jewish political thinkers of the 20th century, that she wrote about the origins of totalitarianism and the nature of evil and the human condition. That's my quick introduction. And most people that I run into are familiar with the banality of evil, if nothing else, even as a concept or a phrase,
right?
Or they have some vague idea of who Hannah Arendt is. And I would say, especially after the 2016 presidential election, when her name started appearing much more in news, essays, articles, and on social media. Right.
Yeah. I mean, she seems to be kind of always on the fringe of popular understanding. Before I get in a little bit more into your book, maybe a little bit more background on Hannah, and also to lead us maybe into the topic of totalitarianism. But I'm going to just get you started by saying that she was born in Hanover, Germany.
Sure.
In 1906. Go for it. I mean, or
go for it. So I do this when I teach Hannah Arendt to a public audience, or when I'm doing an introduction. I'll often start by giving people a little bit of a taste of her life before she emigrated to America. So she was born in 1906 in Linden, Hanover, Germany. You know, when she was 3 years old, her family went to Königsberg, which was the capital of East Prussia at the time, so that her father's syphilis could be treated. He was very sick when she was young. And when she was 7 years old, he died. So Arendt was raised mostly by her mother, Martha. Arendt was very precocious from a young age. By the time she was 14, she knew Greek, Latin. She had read all of Kant, also from Königsberg. And she was reading Karl Jaspers, who she would go on to study with, one of the fathers of German existentialism. By the time she was 15, though, she got kicked out of school for leading a protest against one of her teachers. And she went to Berlin to live alone, to study and prepare for her exams. You know, she studied with Martin Heidegger at the University of Marburg, and then she went to study with Husserl, the great phenomenologist who had been Heidegger's doctor father, and then Karl Jaspers at the University of Heidelberg to study Love and St. Augustine in the classics. So for people who have never studied philosophy, what this basically means is that Hannah Arendt studied with the two German fathers of existentialism and three of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. She published her first book when she was 23. So that always makes everyone feel wonderful. And she became a journalist. She started writing her second work on Rahel Varnhagen, The Life of a Jewish Woman. It was an attempt to understand assimilation in Germany, which made her attuned to what was happening at the time. And in 1933, she was arrested by the Gestapo for conducting what the Nazis called horror propaganda. She was collecting anti-Semitic statements from the Prussian State Library to be sent to world leaders on behalf of the World Zionist Organization. She was held for 8 days, and you write about this in your book as well. And it's an incredible story.
Incredible story. I mean, she's full of incredible stories, but this one was pretty remarkable. Go ahead and tell it as you recall it. Yeah.
Well, so she tells Günter Gauss in her 1964 interview on German national television that it was by pure luck that she was able to escape. She told him stories night after night, keeping him intrigued, and he helped her to kind of maneuver and get out. But Arendt was very aware of what the stakes were, and the next morning she fled with her mother Martha. They went through Prague to Zurich, and then she went to Paris, where she spent the next 8.5 years, mostly working for different Zionist organizations, helping Jewish youth prepare to emigrate, to move to Palestine, to work on kibbutzim, and to work the land. And she was learning Hebrew, she was learning Yiddish. She said she only wanted to do Jewish work at that time. And this was really her turn to the political.
Right, this is all pre-World War II. This is all in the 30s, right? Late 30s up into the early 40s?
This is 1933. So she, yes. 1933 to 1941 is when she escapes. Yeah. And she meets her second husband in Paris, in exile, Heinrich Blücher. They get married, and 4 months after they get married, actually, they're both required to report for internment. Blücher was sent to the Nevers internment camp. Arendt was sent to the Gurs internment camp in the south of France, which had been built to house the Spanish fighters fleeing the Civil War. And after 5.5 weeks, she was part of a mass escape. Another escape of Hannah Arendt. So I'm going to keep throwing in the escapes.
Thank you. You get 25 cents for every one of those.
Yeah, you should. And no, it's an incredible story as well. As the German front approached and orders started falling apart in the camp, the women made a plan to forge documents and walk out at the right moment. And Arendt made her way to Lourdes, where she spent time with Walter Benjamin, and then she went to try and find her husband in Montbon, and she was able to, by chance, after a couple of weeks. And then eventually, with the help of Varian Fry, they were able to secure exit visas and made their way to Port Beau, where Walter Benjamin had tragically died, and then to Lisbon, where they waited for 3 months before sailing to New York. Arendt arrived on Ellis Island on May 22nd, 1941. They had $25, and it was only with a stipend from the World Zionist Organization of America that they were able to rent 2 furnished rooms on West 95th Street, one for them and one for her mother, and they would live there for about 7 years. And so that was the kind of the incredible backstory to her life before she begins writing the work that we are so familiar with today.
Right, and she is essentially stateless when she, I mean, what does she do when she flees Germany? Does she, I mean, she try and get a French passport? I mean, what does she do?
Yeah, so she's stateless. She's stateless for 18 and a half years. Hannah Arendt does not receive American citizenship until 1951, the same year she publishes Origins of Totalitarianism. When she was in exile in Paris, she had applied for all sorts of grants and assistance to help place her as an academic. And I've written a little bit about this online. And unfortunately, none of those came through. Her first choice had been to go to London and then the United States and then Israel. And it wasn't until she was able to secure exit papers that she was able to get to the United States. And then it was as a stateless person. So she had those kind of temporary visa documents. And I have them. They're mostly in the New York Public Library, which is how I was able to include some of the information from them in the book.
Right, but just that part of her life, even way before Origins of Totalitarianism or becoming a US citizen, is so packed with incident and
Yes.
and traumas. How do you feel that, you know, there was something that I saw in a review that I shall not get too deeply into of something, but the person quoted Heidegger in a way and said, well, you know, there's two ways of dealing with, you know, philosophy and philosophers. And I guess, I don't know if it's apocryphal, but he said, oh yeah, Aristotle, he lived. Okay, now let's talk about his work, or something to that effect. I mean, how do you think, why is the life, the lived life, something that attracted you to this story, especially these parts that aren't known? And how does it relate, do you think, to her thinking?
It's a wonderful question, and it's a complicated question. You know, I was trained as a political theorist, and the first thing that I was taught in graduate school was not to confuse the life of a political thinker with their work. And it goes out the window with a thinker like Hannah Arendt. One of my favorite quotes, which I used to open the book, is from this 1972 panel on Hannah Arendt. She had been invited to attend as the guest of honor, and she insisted on participating instead. And she says that all thinking moves from experience. All thinking moves from experience. Thinking moves from the experiences that we have in the world. Our experiences become the material of our thought. And I think in that way, Arendt's work is much more about how to think than what to think. And Heidegger is an interesting figure to hold up in contrast to Hannah Arendt's understanding of self-reflective thinking. And she was very critical of his own work on thinking, because for Heidegger, thinking was unworldly. It was something you did in private, alone by yourself, preferably up in the mountains in a hut, cut off from other people. But for Arendt, thinking and the ethical implications of thinking, how we make political judgments, how we act in the world, how we act towards one another, is deeply worldly, is rooted in conversation, is rooted in the two-in-one conversation of thinking that I have with myself, and is rooted in the conversations that we have with other people. And thinking is part of the process of understanding the world. And from a very early age, Hannah Arendt was hungry to understand the world. And we see that in her early life, even in her mother Martha's Kinderbuch that she had kept about her intellectual development as a small child, in her own self-portrait, The Shadows, and in her poems that were written before the war. You know, I think for me, I was drawn to Arendt's work, the other side of this question, because she wrote in a way that opened my imagination. She kind of opened a window to be a part of the world and made me understand that thinking and academia is not this rarefied place or activity that happens up here in some isolated space, but is deeply worldly and concerned with the most pressing political problems that we are facing.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up the concept of imagination, and that's something that I'd like to get back to. But I wonder, let's talk for a second about this word totalitarianism.
Sure.
A big long word,
Yes.
means a lot, which means a lot, and came out of, you could say, came out of her experiences as so many other things in her did. And I've heard or read across the way that she's kind of often given credit for maybe even kind of coming up with that word. I'm not quite sure, So if you could just talk a little bit about, for those who may not know, and it's sometimes a difficult, like, what's the difference between, say, totalitarianism and despotism or dictatorship or, an absolute monarchy run by a really horrible person who, like,
Sure.
there's a difference there, isn't there?
So Hannah Arendt has made several lasting contributions to politics, political science, political philosophy, and philosophy. Her concept of totalitarianism is one of them. So Arendt coins this term, totalitarianism, as a radically new form of government that emerged in the middle of the 20th century with the appearance of Nazism. And then she understood Bolshevism to be a more advanced form of Nazism. And for Arendt, totalitarianism, as opposed to democracy, fascism, authoritarianism, has a unique set of qualifying elements. So Arendt is using this language of elements and constellation in Origins, and that's her methodology for thinking about what totalitarianism is. And she's taking that from Walter Benjamin and the theses on the philosophy of history, but she wants to look at the various elements of totalitarianism to see how they crystallized into the appearance of totalitarianism as a radically new form of government. So she's doing it this way, and I'll tell you what those are in a second, but she's doing it this way intentionally, because what it means is that the different elements of totalitarianism can last or linger or exist in a society, even if there isn't a totalitarian form of government in place. So Origins is 597 pages. It's 3 books in one. It's a history of anti-Semitism and how anti-Semitism has changed over time. It's a history of imperialism and colonialism that traces the collapse of the nation state in Europe from the 19th into the 20th century. And it's a history of totalitarianism and what this is. And so for Arendt, totalitarianism as a new form of government, and just to kind of add emphasis on this, political thinkers from Plato onward had been thinking about democracy, oligarchy, the traditional 3 forms of government. Totalitarianism, Arendt says, isn't interested in new beginnings. It forecloses the possibility of anything new. Totalitarianism erases any possibility for spontaneity within society in speaking or in acting, because people live in a total state of terror. And she talks about the iron band of totalitarianism, which compresses us together, the atomization of the masses. And she doesn't mean that people are so physically bound together. She means that society has been atomized and that people subscribe to forms of ideological thinking, which doesn't allow for movement and thought. It doesn't allow for an active process of thinking. And totalitarianism is defined by the use of concentration camps.
And another thing I've heard about, phrase applied to is there are what they call surplus people. People become
superfluous people.
Superfluous, yes. And one thing that strikes me as you're talking about this, we know one of the terms, one of the things that's very, very important to Hannah Arendt, and I actually wrote something about it myself, is this idea of natality, newness. I love that about her. And
Yes.
what you've said is that this forecloses that possibility. There can be no generative thought. There can be no natality in this world. But what about, are there, it proposes a thought and a question. One is,
Sure.
Totalitarianism is a new idea, like someone came up with it, but it's like the last idea, right? Because it's like, we came up with this.
Oh, I see.
Who are the beneficiaries of it? I mean, are there some people who are in the in crowd and they're really loving this state?
Well, certainly we know that to be true. And so one of the things that Arendt, there are a couple of things that Arendt kind of changes her mind about after she finishes The Origins of Totalitarianism. And in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she argued that the people were so radically disappeared from the world of appearance by being disappeared into concentration camps and murdered without any form of remembrance, that it was this radical act of erasure that was radical evil. And so Arendt, those are the two things that Arendt kind of changes her thinking on. And she says that there will always be somebody left to remember. There will always be somebody to tell the story. And she argues that it wasn't radical evil. It wasn't the appearance of hell on earth, that the hell on earth was created by people. People had done this, and that this was not some otherworldly force that had caused the Second World War. But this idea of superfluousness is also very important to Arendt's argument about understanding the nature of totalitarianism, because underlying all the various elements she outlines in that book, from the privatization of political institutions to the loss of class society, to the instrumentalization of the state for economic imperialism, to mass joblessness, she offers us three existential conditions of totalitarianism. Homelessness, which isn't just a house, but our language, our gestures, all the things that make us comfortable in forming habits in our daily lives. Homelessness, rootlessness, a sense of not being rooted into a community, tradition, and loneliness. When she gets to the last 10 pages of the book, she talks about loneliness as the underlying cause of all totalitarian movements. And the word that she uses for that is actually not our word loneliness. It's the German word Verlassenheit. She's taken it from Nietzsche. And it means abandonness, a sense of feeling abandoned in the world. And this word of superfluous, of feeling oneself to be superfluous, I think is so resonant to our contemporary political situation today. And thinking about the loss of dignity, community, meaning in one's life.
I mean, another quote that, and forgive me, I'm sure you mentioned it in the book, but I remember coming across it very, very early on when I was starting to learn about her. And somebody said she had a genius for friendship. And
Yes.
I think that this notion of friendship as an antidote to loneliness, or a way of getting meaning. Could you speak a little bit about that? Because she seemed, if you look at her life as I did, you'd think that there had to be 5 of her, because she lived with so many lives at the same time, right?
Just looking at her correspondence,
Right.
You start to think there must have been many of her. She was a plurality.
Special in relate. I mean, she really privileged these types of creative, or I mean, can you talk a little bit about her relations with people, since it seems to be such an important part of her thinking?
Friendship was very important to Arendt. It was very important to how she understood home in the world, how she understood love, how she understood community. She says in the Günter Gauss interview that I mentioned a few minutes ago, when he asks her, "So you don't love any people?" And she says, "No, I only love my friends." And friendship for Arendt existed in the realm of privacy and intimacy. Friendship is where she could retreat from her public life as a public intellectual, as a thinker, as a writer, and she could nourish these intimate relationships. One of her closest female friends, which some people might know, some people may not, was Hilda Frankel, who she had met through Paul Tillich, the theologian. And she writes these beautiful letters to her saying, "You are the only person in the world that I can fully be myself with." Her correspondence with Mary McCarthy, the American novelist, is exquisite. It's this beautiful love relationship that they cultivate and nourish, where they don't just exchange ideas, they care for one another in the way that family cares for one another. And she called her close circle of friends her tribe. She had her tribe, and they were a home for each other. She called her husband her four walls, and she understood this space of friendship to be a space of deep personal and intellectual nourishment, which made her work, which made the work of thinking and understanding possible. But you see all of these incredible acts of friendship throughout her correspondence, sending care packages to Carl and Gertrude, Jaspers, protecting WH audit,
Didn't
defending her friends.
right. It's a very deep concept. I think it even goes back to some Greek thinkers talk about the importance of friendship.
Aristotle.
Yeah, Aristotle would be one. Yeah, he's important. So it struck me when I was doing my book, and I kind of touched on this. And when she gets to the Eichmann affair, which I wanted to kind of not talk about in my book, but you kind of can't avoid it. One of the things that I would have thought would have been very particularly painful to her was that she lost many friends. She also had some people that held close to her, but she still, in my interpretation of it, that was her. She courageously bore that. I mean, I think it was a pain that she had to carry. Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, was she hurt by the abandonment of some people or others? I mean, was she, this is a woman who seems so strong, a tough woman, yet these things affect her. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think two stories kind of come to mind. One is that, after Eichmann in Jerusalem was published in 1963, Arendt spent a good portion of her career after that trying to understand what had happened. And by what had happened, I mean why people had responded in the way that they did. In her mind, as she spoke about it on many occasions, she had gone to Israel, she had seen the trial, and she had reported what she saw. That was her factual truth. And people told her that, no, that's not what happened. And she wrote about it, and people responded to things she had never written. And so she wanted to understand what happens to not just to herself, but to the world when that understanding of common sense, factual truth falls apart. And so I think the sheer amount of time that she spent trying to grapple with the aftermath of her reportage on Eichmann is testament to how deeply it affected her and how much space it occupied in her thinking.
Yeah. And, I think the famous comments, I don't love people, and you mentioned those sorts of things before. She speaks a little bit about a concept that is very, very important to her, and I don't think we hear about it enough, but she talks about being a pariah, a conscious pariah.
Yes.
And could you explain a little bit what that means and why that is important? And on the heels of that, you could say that a pariah might be like somebody who's trying to be a provocateur, or is there a right way to be a pariah or a wrong way? I mean, just speak a little bit about what that means.
That's a very good question, Ken. And I think that's a question worth parsing in our contemporary political moment today. But let's set that, I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm going to set it in brackets for a second. And let me just start by saying, I think your illustrations of Hannah Arendt capture the cheekiness of her conscious pariah attitude. I can always see it in the way that you brought her to life for us. And so I know you can answer this question as well as I can.
Well, and it's something that as a cartoonist, and we're a pariah profession in many ways, just sort of seeing the light of day.
True.
So I'm real curious.
Comedians.
Yeah.
and others.
The word pariah, people don't really know what it means, but talk about this.
It comes from her early work on Rahel Varnhagen, who had a salon and been a friend and pupil of Goethe's. And Rahel, Arendt said Rahel was her best friend. It was only that she died 100 years before she had been born. And at the end of that book, which Arendt didn't finish until after the war, it was interrupted by the war. It was meant to be her habilitation, her second book to secure a teaching position in Germany. She comes back to something that Rahel said on her deathbed, which is that it was only then, when she was about to die, that she realized what she thought had been the greatest curse of her life, her Jewish identity, had been the greatest blessing of her life. And so through Arendt's engagement with Rahel, she comes to these terms, Parvenu, Pariah, and then Arendt conceptualizes the self-conscious pariah. And then when she's in Paris in exile, the story that she uses to illustrate it comes from an experience that she had. So a good example of how experience informs her conceptual thinking. And she tells the story of a Mr. Cohn who was forced to leave Germany. So he went to France, he became the best French citizen, and then he had to go to Switzerland, he became the best Swiss citizen. And on and on. And Arendt says that he would be doomed to live a miserable life as long as he was one of these Ulysses-typed wanderers who was unwilling to accept what he was, a Jewish man. And for Arendt, that's the kind of classic example of the parvenu. The pariah, the self-conscious pariah, and she does make some distinctions there, but the self-conscious pariah is somebody who proudly carries their identity with them through the world. There's a great letter in her correspondence with Karl Jaspers shortly after the war ends, and she hasn't been in the United States for that long, and she writes to him, this whole American melting pot is a myth. The great thing about the United States is that there are all of these communities where people are free to bring their traditions with them. And for Arendt, that was very important. And the other side of this is that Arendt, in Origins and in her work on the Jewish pariah, connected the history of assimilationism to anti-Semitism. And yes.
Yeah, I mean, you've, and I hope we're getting some questions from, seem to be have some people out there, but you're bringing up some really, and the thing that's wonderful about Hannah Arendt, and the thing, I quoted the old, any of you have been in New York City for a long time, used to ride the subway, there was this great ad campaign for the Roach Motel, and it had one of the great headlines, "The Roaches check in, but they never check out." And I say with Hannah Arendt's world, well, you check into Hannah Arendt and you can never check out. It's endless.
That rings a little bit too true for me.
Yeah, well, it depends how your apartment is, but you bring about the question of identity, and you bring up the question of plurality, which is a very, very, a word that we, again, a lot of times the way Hannah Arendt uses words, they're very easy to not understand them.
Yes.
And I feel that and in your description of what she kind of liked about America, it sort of sounds like a pluralistic vision that attracted her to it. Whether or not, that is fulfilling its promise is another topic. But can you talk, was plurality, I hate to be so simple, but like an antidote or something that would help against totalitarianism? I don't, or is there any connection there? Or talk a little about plurality, because that's a hard one.
Yeah, so Hannah Arendt writes about plurality in the human condition, which was the book she published after the Origins of Totalitarianism in 1958. And it was meant to be a kind of follow-up to Origins. And I always say if Origins is about the emergence of totalitarianism, then the human condition is about how we can protect spaces of freedom. And Arendt talks about the fundamental elements of the human condition. So for any kind of politics, philosophy nerds who might be listening in, within the tradition of philosophy that Arendt emerged out of, there's a kind of tradition of talking about the social contract, of imagining what the kind of fundamental elements of the human condition are. Arendt rejects this. She says there's no kind of ontological feeling or position that every single human being possesses. No. So what is it? It's plurality for Arendt. And what does that mean? It means that nobody exists here alone. We appear in the world with others. No man is an island. And that we're all unique and we're only equal in the sense that we're different from one another. And it's very much tied to her conception of natality, which for Arendt is the root of all action in the world. But natality is our ability to act, but we can never predict the outcome of our actions. And so, for example, when she gets to the end of Eichmann in Jerusalem, and she makes the extra legal argument that Eichmann has to die, she says he has to die because of his crime against humanity. What was his crime against humanity? It was that he had violated this fundamental principle of the human condition, plurality. The fact that we all have a right to be here because we all appeared here. And just because we appear differently from one another doesn't mean anyone else has any greater right to be here.
Right. And I think, that feeds into a lot of things that come out of her life growing up in a world where really emotion and the destruction of people could just barge into your home and take away your name, your possessions, it just willy-nilly had to have a massive effect on her psyche. And
yes.
And I don't think she ever said, we've talked about this, she wasn't the kind of philosopher who, and I won't name any names, had 14 acolytes following them around, lighting their cigarette, carrying their briefcases, and so on and so forth. She didn't really want that. In fact, Tagaushi, she very famously says, I don't even think of myself as a philosopher.
Yes.
And I think it really, for those of you who, there's a lot, I hate this term, to unpack, but you've got these outside, the promise and forgiveness. Forgiveness is another incredibly subtle notion, but very, very important, I think. But I want to get to some questions because we have questions, and I said I wouldn't read them, but one popped up, and I'm sorry to chuck this one at you right now, but we only have 20 minutes left.
Do it.
So
bring on the question.
Susanna Reamer Landres says, how would you apply Hannah Arendt to today's society and global challenges that we have to grapple with? And what message maybe resonates with you most if there is one thing that, I know we've got a world of problems, but what would you think?
So Arendt says that to look to the past in order to solve the problems today is a mythological error. Hannah Arendt's work is not about telling us what to think. It's not a frame to look through, but it's about how to think. And I think in that way, Arendt's work can help give us a language for making sense of the political crises we face today. And I think this goes to what Ken was just saying too, what you were saying and drawing out, is that Arendt was very attentive to language and the idea that speaking is a form of action, but W.H. Auden, the poet, said that Arendt could almost be read like a dictionary. She gives us a really rich vocabulary of ideas that we can bring into our thinking. I think the book of Hannah Arendt's that's most important to our political condition today is The Human Condition. If you want to think with one of Hannah Arendt's books right now, The Human Condition talks about the specter of technology, man's desire to escape Earth. She talks about the loss of distinction between public life and private life. She talks about the need for remembrance. What is political action? She talks about identity politics. She talks about forgiveness. She talks about alienation and loneliness and thinking. And I think that book right now really speaks to a myriad of the conversations that we're having.
Yeah. Sydney, do you want
Yeah,
to jump in and moderate a little bit?
sure. Yeah.
With
And
some
I
of the
mean, Ken,
questions?
also feel free, I know you're both quite knowledgeable about this topic. So, Samantha, though, when I was reading your book, I was particularly interested sort of by her relationship with Heidegger and kind of how complicated it got. And I wonder if you can kind of just expand on what that relationship was like and really how
How
it
much time do we
have
have
a really
left?
long-term impact. Yeah, I know, right? We've got 20 minutes, so do what you can.
No, so this is certainly a very complicated part of Hannah Arendt's legacy. When Elizabeth Young Bruhl granted access to Hannah Arendt's correspondence at the German Literature Archive in Marbach in the 1980s, after Arendt's death, the world became aware that she had had a romantic relationship with Martin Heidegger, who was a Nazi and had joined the Nazi Party. And Arendt broke off their relationship in 1933 when she found out about his activities, and she resumed the relationship after the war. And that's the part that is, I think, very difficult for a lot of people who engage with Hannah Arendt's work. And this, for her, goes to forgiveness, to reconciliation, and how it is that we think about who a person is in relationship to what a person does, and whether or not the whole of a person's life can be reduced to horrible decisions, to a horrible act. And for Arendt, forgiveness was something that was always interpersonal, that happened between people, one-on-one, to not for the person who's doing the forgiving, but for the person who needs to be forgiven, so that they're not bound by whatever thing that they had done. And for Heidegger, for Arendt says to Jaspers in her correspondence, he's basically guilty of murder in my mind. I can't believe what he did to Husserl, signing the letter that dismissed all Jewish people from academic post in the German university system. And she really wrestles with her relationship with him. And we see this in her most clearly in her correspondence. But he was, and there's no other way to say this, he was the great passionate love of her life. And that was something that remained with her. Her husband was her home. Her husband is what gave her the sense of freedom to go careening through the world and do the work that she had to do. And Heidegger was the kind of poetic, romantic love affair that she had throughout her life. There's a lot to say about it.
Yeah.
Well, here, let me, since you're on the
and what do you think?
Well, no, I'm going to say, since you're, well, in my book, I made my own determination based on the fact that I read many books at the time, and I know a lot of the correspondence isn't out there, and basically, you read 4 or 5 of them and they get 4 or 5 different answers. So I felt it was sort of fair game for me to make my own interpretation, and you'll have to read the book to find that out. But since Sam's on kind of on the hot seat, I see some questions in the Q&A, and I'll chuck them to you and see what you do with them.
All right.
I'll just bring up the F word. No, not that one. Feminism.
I knew where you were going.
Yeah. Somebody says, somebody says, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but I'll read you the question. Why do you think that Arendt was so uncomfortable with feminism?
So Hannah Arendt swore a holy oath, she writes in one letter, to never touch the question of feminism, by which she meant specifically second wave feminism in the United States. There's one letter I was looking at recently from Gloria Steinem that had been sent to Hannah Arendt asking her to sign a petition for Roe. No response from Arendt. Arendt did not consider herself to be a feminist. And she writes about this most clearly in a 1929 book review that she wrote while she was living in Frankfurt. It's a review of a German book called On the Women Problem, on the Frauen Problem. And she makes an argument there that she sticks with throughout her life, that the problem of women, as it were, as it was put in that book, is an economic problem. That this is a question of economic and social equality and not identity for Arendt. And there's that distinction that she draws again between who we are and what we are. And she says that just because somebody is born a woman doesn't mean that they belong to a woman's movement. And she saw any kind of political movement as having a kind of prescription, a kind of ideological way of thinking that said this is the right way to think about this. And that kind of framework for Arendt was always a non-starter. It didn't matter if it was Marxism, feminism, socialism, Bolshevism, conservatism. She avoided all isms. Isms were for her were signs of ideological thinking. But having said that, I will also say that, Hannah Arendt is one of the most important and famous political thinkers of the 20th century. I don't think being a feminist necessarily implies a set of political beliefs. And if you watch that 64 interview with Günter Gauss, she's very cheeky with him in a playful way. And you really get a sense of her irony. He asks her, so you're a woman in philosophy. How is that? Is it a problem? And she says, of course, it's always a problem, but I do my work. And of course, this drove many feminists mad. Adrienne Rich probably most famously wrote about it, trying to really understand how the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, who was a woman, wouldn't talk about women's issues.
And there's a couple of questions on this, and there are other isms, being brought up, but how do and maybe you could say it's part of the social sphere, that in between place, but how does plurality work to make sure that social groups or constructs are protected, yet not, maybe you could say, privileged? I don't exactly know how to put that. Elizabeth Kaplan wrote a question saying, how can you build consensus without becoming sort of then becoming like dominated by states, or authoritarianism? Like when do social movements, it's very tricky for me because and she makes some mistakes on it, but yeah, how does she deal with that? I'm sorry.
Are you thinking of something specifically?
I'm thinking of Zionism. I'm also thinking of Little Rock. I'm thinking of, and she, and she does say, I will make mistakes, but I'm getting back to the fact of, like, can a pluralistic, I think I might have even asked you this at one time, Plato comes up with this ideal world that we're not really supposed to live in. Is Hannah's pluralistic world attainable?
I don't think she gives us an idea of what that world is. I think that she's trying to understand what is happening while she's alive. She says at the end of her preface to The Human Condition that the point is to stop and think what we are doing, and that we have to continuously be doing that from the vantage point of our most recent experiences, fears, desires. And so there is no, she's not a utopian thinker.
Yeah, but when
in that book, that idea of political action, of appearing in the public realm, of acting together in concert. We can't act alone. We have to act in concert with others. For Arendt, if the tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, it doesn't fall. And so when she's talking about social equality, I think there's kind of two things happening. One, she makes the argument that we have to make the argument one-on-one. We have to actually go out into the world physically, talk to people, make arguments. But for Arendt, social discrimination is part of the fabric of life. People make judgments, people have opinions, people are going to have taste. She doesn't have a kind of utopian vision of living in a society where there's not going to be any more prejudice. And I think that's very difficult for some readers of Arendt to wrestle with. And it is, I think you said contradiction. I think it does appear as a contradiction in her work in some places. She says in The Human Condition that every part of our life is touched by politics. And then she draws this very, kind of sharp and yet porous distinction between our private life and our public life. She talks about how the greatest political virtue is courage to appear in public and make an argument and perhaps be attacked physically, verbally. But she doesn't talk about how not everybody has equal amounts of courage to appear in that public space, or how we get to a place where everybody feels comfortable enough or okay enough to appear in that public space and say what they're thinking. And so she doesn't give us answers on that. She just gives us this kind of framework for thinking with her through some of these questions.
Yeah, talk for a minute, and I know, keep an eye on the time, Sydney, but about thinking. She has a very, she has a wonderful quote, and I think, she condemns people who don't think through or think in the right way. Not the right way. She's not trying to be authoritarian about thinking, but she says that, she says there are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is a dangerous act.
Yes.
And she's saying that everybody should think.
Yeah.
So she's saying we should live in a dangerous world. Shouldn't it be a safe world? Shouldn't everybody just be happy?
Not that kind of danger. So Arendt has a very idiosyncratic understanding of what thinking is when she's talking about thinking. She's talking about self-reflective thinking, where the self-conscious can draw into conversation the conscious being the moral sensibility that we have that tells us what's right and what's wrong and how to act in the world and why we should drive the speed limit down the road and why we should, not slam the door in our neighbor's face, right? So thinking is a space where we can open up this conversation in ourselves to hold ourselves accountable to how it is we act in the world. And she's taking this from Kant and the idea of having an expansive imagination. It's a kind of political empathy that allows us to expand our thinking so outside of ourselves. And for Arendt, thinking is dangerous because it has the ability to uproot what we believe, what we take for granted in our thinking. It makes us aware of how we think and why we think certain things. Thinking for Arendt is very much at the heart of her work. Her last work, The Life of the Mind, begins with a book on thinking. And this is the great kind of negative claim that she makes in talking about the banality of evil, is that this form of self-reflective thinking might have the ability to prevent evil from happening in the world. She says that Eichmann obviously thought he was very smart. He was very good at thinking about what he did, but he lacked the ability to imagine the world from the perspective of another.
Yeah.
And
doesn't she say, of the other guy, it almost becomes like maybe it's such a translation I've seen of it, but she talks about like common, it's very like he didn't think about it from the perspective of the other person. It's like, we might call that empathy today, but I'm not quite sure.
It's not the kind of empathy that we talk about colloquially today. It's a kind of philosophical conception of empathy that doesn't have anything to do with feelings, but is about imagining the ethical consequences of our actions so that we might judge differently.
Somebody asked a question here, and I think it's maybe kind of somewhat related to it. And evil, she quote this person, I'm not sure, anonymous, says, evil is thought defying, cliches are its comfort.
Yes.
Cliche is a word that she uses a lot, and we have it in our common language. Oh, that's a cliche. Does she think of it differently? What does this mean?
So this goes back to our conversation about language. For Arendt, a person's speech reflects the quality of their thinking. If a person only speaks in prefabulated sentences, if they only speak in cliches or idioms, then they're not thinking presently, responding to what's in front of them. They're just reactively responding. One of my favorite quotes, which is just a sentence she writes in one of her notebooks, is "Gibt es ein Denken, das nicht tyrannisch ist?" Is there a way of thinking? Is there a way of thinking that's not tyrannical? Is there a way of thinking that's not tyrannical? And she follows that by saying the point is to not be swallowed in the tide at all. How can you remain an independent, self-conscious, critical thinker? And somebody who speaks in cliches is revealing a kind of absence of thinking. Thinking is something that we do.
So how can you not fall into that? Like what do you do?
What do I do?
Yeah.
I isolate myself in the woods and sit alone with my books. That's only slightly an exaggeration. But Arendt kind of describes the conditions for this form of thinking. It requires a space of privacy. It requires that we be alone by ourselves. And that doesn't mean having our cell phone in our hand or having the laptop open in the corner. It's that space of being alone with oneself and being in harmony with oneself. It requires solitude. And solitude is that pleasurable state of being able to keep ourselves company. And it's there where we can have this conversation with ourselves and we can become aware of how it is that we think. But that's also, and Ken, I don't, maybe you know something about this. She says that's also where we tell stories to ourselves about the experiences that we have and make meaning from them.
Well, yes, I mean, so the whole topic of Hannah Arendt as a curator, cultivator, appreciator of story, and how ethics may even come out of it. I mean, if you look, the book that I really, really like is Men in Dark Times, which interestingly, two of them are women. So, we're not talking about, men, but there's a phrase somewhere in her writing, but stories reveal meaning without committing the error of defining it. Yes. And if you think about that, that's why, I think, that empowers me, because Cinderella isn't just about like, her parents didn't like her and she was misunderstood. And we wouldn't be listening to that story 1,000 years later or whatever. It's about a way to live that, and in many ways, I look at some of her writing and I see it all as poetry, but that's how I read. But it's not to me a mistake that arguably probably one of the greatest American poets and critics of the last century, and one of the greatest British poets and critics of the last century, Auden and McCarthy and the other guy who wrote The Tail Gunner, the great American poet laureate, Jarrell, were really, really reckoned her way of thinking. And I think it's these are wonderful stories of how we live, but then you find truth in stories and it's hard to define them. That's the game that she's playing.
Yeah, it's about meaning and making meaning. And for fun, Jarrell is one of the people who taught her to write in English.
That's right. Yeah, Randall Jarrell, incredible. But this has been an amazing conversation. Sydney, can you wrap it up?
I have one final question for the both of you. We've had a couple people ask, besides your wonderful books, are there any other books that you can recommend that people should read to sort of get an introduction to Hannah Arendt, and also besides her books, I guess.
I'll take the easy one. You got to read Elizabeth Youngbrill's book. I think that's she was her student. It was the major tome, and there's a lot of wonderful stuff in there. So I think it was called For the
Love of the World.
For the Love of the World, Amor Mundi. So that's definitely one. Also works very well as a doorstop if you need one.
Behind me somewhere.
Sam, what have you got?
So I did an interview on this for 5 books, and I broke it down into what your interest is. So if you want to see Arendt's more poetic side, if you want some beautiful portraits of people who were important to her thinking, go for Men in Dark Times. I think The Human Condition is the book that's most relevant to our contemporary political situation right now. There's a wonderful volume called Thinking Without a Banister. It's also a great doorstop. It was compiled by Jerome Cohn, Hannah Arendt's literary executor, and it is a great overview of all of the key ideas in Arendt's work. It really touches on everything from totalitarianism to Marxism to private public labor work action, freedom, the promise of politics, loneliness, Heidegger, American political elections. It's all in there. It's a great kind of introductory volume I use for teaching intro to Arendt classes.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been such an interesting conversation to listen to. I've learned so much. I'm sure I'm going to go on an Arendt very deep dive now. And I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us, all of you out there. Everything we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. To those of you watching, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member and joining us for our upcoming programs, one of which will also include Ken, which you can check out at the link in the Zoom chat. So have a great night, and thank you again for joining us, and thank you again to Ken and Samantha.
Thank you. Thank you, Sydney. Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Cindy.
Thanks.